Good afternoon. I'm Pablo Chavez. I'm part of the DC policy team here at Google. First of all, thank you all very much for joining us. This is the maiden voyage of our DC Talks restart in our new space. We've actually been remodeling for the last few months, and I can't think of a better way to start this up again than by having this panel joining us today. Vijay, Tony, and Aneesh talking about innovation in the ideas economy. It's a great honor to have you guys. Thanks for doing this with us. Before we get started, I'm going to hand this over to Brad Belt. Hey, Brad, from the Milken Institute. Just want to say thank you to the folks at Milken for co-sponsoring this event with us. We're really excited about it, and we look forward to doing more things with you guys. So, thanks.
Thank you, Pablo, and join Pablo in welcoming you to this afternoon's program. This is actually the March Madness halftime. And what we'll do is a public service announcement, since I suspect many of the graduates here in this room are from Vanderbilt or Harvard. We'll give you regular updates on the score. It's great to be able to partner with Google. I want to thank Pablo and Jenna and Erica for making this space available to do this program. I think it's going to be a very exciting one, focused on the ideas economy. Very profound implications, as I think we all realize. Really central to what the Milken Institute is all about as well. Innovation is a central tenet of the work that the Milken Institute does. Leveraging intellectual and financial capital in new and innovative ways to increase access to capital markets, to improve health outcomes, to create jobs. We do this through our innovation summits, through the important work that our Faster Cures team up here upstairs, sixth floor, does in biomedical research. We do this through our convening functions like our global conference out in LA. A little plug here, April 29 to May 2nd. Put it on your calendars. We'd love to see many of you out there. With that effort, I want to turn the program over to our very distinguished panel. To my immediate right is Aneesh Chopra. Many of you know Aneesh. He was our nation's first chief technology officer. He is no longer that. You might ask him in the Q&A what he intends to do next, and we'll see what he has to say. But he's been an advocate of open innovation, and I think that will be part of the conversation. Next to Aneesh is Vijay Vaitheeswaran, and I'm not going to say that 3 times rapidly. I'm lucky to get it out of my mouth once. Vijay is a senior economist, a senior journalist for The Economist. He's also written a fascinating new book that I commend to your attention, Need, Greed, and Speed. Thanks to the generosity of our friends at Google, there are actually copies available for folks here, and I believe Vijay is willing to sign some of those copies after the program. And to try to moderate this small herd of cats, we have Tony Fratto. We're delighted that Tony's been able to join us. Tony is the founder of Hamilton Place Strategies. Many of you know him as a former deputy press secretary in the Bush administration. He was also the chief spokesman at the Treasury Department before that, a regular contributor on CNBC. These guys have been kind of working out their script, their little song and dance here over the last few minutes. I expect this to be a lot of fun. Sit back and enjoy, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Thanks very much.
Thanks to Google and Milken Institute. And one thing I definitely want to make clear for everyone, we're going to start this conversation, but this is going to be a conversation with Aneesh and Vijay and the 250 of you in the room here is really where we want to get to. Maybe Aneesh will call this an open interview.
Yes,
okay.
I like that.
All right. But we are here in the nation's capital, and we have the former and first chief technology officer of the United States, and so the question, it was a question we had at dinner last night, and this issue came up as well, right? Which is that if we're going to have government, and Vijay, I want you to address this also, it's going to be a great deal. What is the role of government to bring innovation to this economy, and what are the biggest pitfalls for getting innovative ideas applied in a way that are meaningful and useful for Americans and businesses?
Well, maybe I'll just kick it off to get started. We see three roles for government that in today's economy are needed, not just for the turnaround, the current challenges in the economy, but to position us for the long term, which we think an innovation strategy is really focused on long-term economic growth. First, that the government's at its best when it invests in infrastructure. Now, traditionally, we define infrastructure as roadways, railways, and runways, but we're increasingly expanding that definition to include research and development as infrastructure, and we also include digital infrastructure. The president recently signed into law our National Wireless Initiative to make sure that the United States wins the third wave of economic growth in the internet era, that in mobile broadband. So that's the first role. We invest in the infrastructure of the American economy. Second, we set the rules of the American economy in a manner that promotes long-term economic growth, innovation, and entrepreneurship. We refer to this as the role of government acting as impatient convener. We set out internationally to think about internet policy principles, just as an example, where 34 countries from the OECD have all endorsed a framework that essentially calls for voluntary enforceable codes of conduct that are a bit more agile, but have teeth so that they set rules of the road in this growing market economy. And I believe you saw that in the privacy announcement that the White House issued just a couple months ago, emphasizing, again, voluntary codes of conduct operationally in the domestic economy for privacy. And then third, we see, the president refers to this as an all-hands-on-deck approach, where the government's just one component of a larger mosaic where we're trying to solve the big challenges of our day in health, energy, and education. And for that, we've emphasized what we are calling our open innovation strategy, where the government's role is to release data or collect it where it previously isn't made available, where it's also to engage in these enforceable codes of conduct, and more specifically, technically, in the standards discussion, to bring down the barriers to entry. And we work very closely on now a new tool of government, introducing prizes, challenges, and competitions, complementary to traditional grants and procurement, where capital, modest as it may be, can be used to pay for outcomes and to inspire. These are the three tools and roles that we see in a bit more of a different model of activist government than you'd otherwise be accustomed to.
You know, there's much to like in what Aneesh has just outlined. If only that were the only things that government did, I would be so pleased. And if all dictators were as benevolent as our first and beloved Chief Technology Officer, I think we would all be very happy. My footnote to that, modest footnote, is to simply point out the history of government involvement in spurring innovation is a tragic one that's littered with failures, whether it's here in the United States with trying to do synthetic petroleum in the wake of the 70s shocks, with what France is now doing. There's a great resurgence in industrial policy, particularly in continental Europe, where they've declared in France, for example, that toy making is a strategic industry that must be subsidized by the French taxpayer. A real example. And so I am a little bit more skeptical, perhaps, than Aneesh. But let me start by saying, with the things he pointed out, the Open Gov initiative, the role of incentive prizes, where the administration deserves a lot of credit for opening up to all parts of the government, not only certain parts like NASA that had used it before, but across various different kinds of the government. And this is a great example of how we can harness greed for good. That's the greed in my title. I'm a big believer in Schumpeterian creative destruction. I believe a lot of the solutions to the wicked problems that we face. And I do think we live in an era of very dangerous global problems, be they the threat of deadly pandemics or climate change and the resource crunch to come. At the national level, we have the middle class squeeze, where we are living through, and people here at Google, and many of you are helping make an innovation revolution happen in an age of exponential technologies. But at the same time, many in the middle classes of the developed economies are increasingly left out. They don't have access to the tools and don't know the rules of the new innovation economy, hence the middle class squeeze in part. And at the level of the individual, we are experiencing career tracks and educational systems that are not preparing us to participate in the ideas economy. We're still stuck with a model of education that came out of the Industrial Revolution, where people are treated as commodities, one-size-fits-all education. And we need to keep relearning how to learn. This is the fundamental challenge that I take up in my book and talk about it sometimes. So I think given this very disruptive age we're living in, I'm very hopeful that if we can relearn these skills and learn some of the new tools, we can tame the wicked global problems. And government will play an enabling role, but the fundamental essence, the spice, as it were, of innovation, I still believe comes from the bottom up. And it can be from entrepreneurs in the private sector, the dynamic social sector, where there's a lot of dynamism in hybrid business models, social entrepreneurs. We see whether it's Ashoka or Acumen Fund or a number of the innovative hybrid business models and chain value chains that are emerging. And of course, in government itself, by opening up and being more in tune with citizenry. I think these are the kinds of models we need to embrace. It's a riskier world, one where we all have to move faster, but I don't think government can do more than help us get to that place of enabling innovation and hopefully stay out of the way.
Are there clean lines, Aneesh, for what government role can be? Because we know that certainly in standard setting, right?
Yes.
We talk a little bit about standard setting
Yes.
and how that creates an environment opportunity for innovation in the private sector, right? But we also know that there are areas that I think we'd all agree are arguable as to whether, we're not going to leave here today without talking about, an investment in something, right? And investment in technology, what's the best role for government there? But certainly it's raised a great deal of, a lot of questions about whether that's, that sort of venture investing role is a role that government ought to be playing.
Let me answer that question with a tale of two policies, and you can draw your own conclusions. So we inherited the loan guarantee program. That's not one that the Obama administration had birthed. It was an initiative that was available, that was able to be funded out of the Recovery Act. So Congress had actually put the architecture together for the loan guarantee program, and it was what you described. People apply, and there's a selection process, and it's competitive, and there's an answer. We did birth, however, in the Recovery Act, the Health IT program. And let me just contrast the two. We're given the keys to design it. What we said in Health IT was we're going to set standards, a high bar. Any vendor that met the standards was eligible. So instead of applying to Washington for permission to be the chosen few capable of delivering this sort of upgrade to the economy, we said, here's this bar. It's a definition, for those of you who followed it, meaningful use. We defined meaningful use in a certain manner that said things like, does your software allow patients to get an electronic copy of their own medical record within a certain time period of their request? Can that software communicate with the public health department to ensure that accurate statistics are made available for disease surveillance and that type of thing? So we had these 20 or so requirements, and when we entered the administration, about 100 or so products had previously been sort of deemed certified as being electronic medical records, but it was not clear exactly to what end those applications were meant to be put to use. By putting into this meaningful use rule, setting the bar, we now have over 600 vendors. Many of them are less than 50 employees, because and some of them were birthed after we passed the rules. So in that kind of nimble, the first native iPad app, Dr. Chrono got certified as a medical record. They didn't even exist when the Recovery Act. So by opening up and using standards to drive it, now every single vendor has a fair shot. You knock on a doctor's door or a hospital's door, and it's their choice which certified product they work with.
Some will win and some will lose.
Some will win and some will lose. And what's even more powerful is then we're publishing, Medicare is publishing the actual results every month. We're listing how many doctors, what vendors did they pick, and Wall Street investment analyst firms like Sanford Bernstein and others are now giving a report. Hey, the market's speaking. Vendor A is up, vendor B is down, and it's creating an immense amount of pressure, all private-led. So in that example, to be very candid, we inherited a program that was more traditional, apply and select, and we birthed one that was quite, I would argue, standards-driven and open. And you can see, look, nothing is clean. You asked me, is it clean? No, we inherited a lot of these, we built it. But I would just take a look at that model too and say, what effect does that have? VC investments in health IT up, not down. It's up 46%. Biotech and med device investments down. So you're starting to see, and that's all enabling infrastructure in the new value-based payment movement. We can have a discussion on healthcare all night. But the point is, just keep an open mind when you say, what's the Obama tracker of innovation? Please look at both of the models.
At least the arc that you trace is an encouraging one of how government is shifting and thinking about innovation. And this is a good trend. And part of what I try to do with Economist, and one of the reasons I wrote this book, is a bit of a call to arms to encourage this kind of trajectory, to speed it up. I'd like to see a role for government because it is essential as an enabler of innovation. In fact, tomorrow I've been asked by the leading scientific societies that we have in the country to moderate a couple of sessions, one at the House, one at the Senate, on improving the effectiveness of federal R&D. Because I do believe blue sky research, for example, is absolutely essential, and on areas like energy, for example, over the last 30 years, we have underinvested. There's absolutely no doubt. The reason the pipeline is as dry as it is because government and private sector underinvested in energy, just to give one example. So I encourage the appropriate role, carefully circumscribed, for government, and to think more creatively. But I don't see enough of the fresh thinking you're talking about, and that's what I also wanted to point out. Just to stick with the analogy since we're on energy, the idea that a moonshot, which is very popular here in Washington, will solve climate change and the clean energy crisis, as it were. I want to challenge this, and I know I won't make a lot of friends in saying this, perhaps in this town, but and I say this actually with tremendous respect for NASA. As in my earlier incarnation, I trained as an engineer at MIT, actually worked on the space station program back in an earlier incarnation, and have friends in NASA who I, again, respect tremendously. But the problem of sending a man to the moon once, cost be damned, to beat the Soviets, was a very different kind of problem than the problem we face today. That is, finding a way to provide clean energy to 7 billion people on Earth in a manner that's affordable, sustainable, convenient. The latter problem requires a bottom-up solution. It requires mind and money to connect with markets. It requires experimentation, failure. You're not going to get distribution, no matter how well-intentioned the top-down model. However intelligent and brilliant the technocrats in charge, it's going to involve failure. And that's a big part of what we need to learn, is how to fail gracefully, whether in our own lives, whether in government, whether in corporate world, to allow and encourage failure, but also fast failure. How do we build learning systems that learn a lot more?
That's the best rule, right? If you're going to fail very, very quickly.
Yeah.
Yes, but don't bury the failures.
Right.
How many of you in this audience, let me take a guess, raise your hands if you put all your failures at the top of your resume. Right? I mean, we're here at Google, and even here I'm not seeing, and it's a self-selected crowd of innovationistas, right? So, and yet, if we want to increase the metabolism of the global innovation economy, something I presume we're all interested in, we want to tame these wicked problems that we have to dare, we have to try more. I want us to embrace a more ambitious vision of innovation that involves a greater tolerance for failure, for experimentation, but also building in learning systems. There's a company nearby, WL Gore, that makes Gore-Tex fabrics. And one of the things they do when they kill a project, they throw a party. A little cheesy perhaps, but just something to think about on how to reward and think about failure and learning systems.
It's a really difficult lesson in this town, right? Which where your failures do get put at the top of your resume, whether you like it or not, right?
So I say embrace it, do it yourself.
Exactly.
And say, here's what I learned, and here's what my company learned, or here's what my government learned.
That's exactly right. Well, what has changed here? What are the things that have changed here? We're talking about an increased role for government in leading innovations, encouraging innovation. But we do that at a time actually where we have really an explosion of innovation, right? We have an explosion of technology, explosion of thinking, explosion of ways to share ideas. So why a greater role now than, say, 15 or 100 years ago? Why a greater role?
Let me jump in 1 second. If I might just offer a definition, because one thing I've learned in talking about innovation is that it's probably the most abused word in the English language, right? Everybody's in favor of innovation, but people often mean different things. So at least as a working definition, let me suggest innovation is not invention. It's not fundamentally about technology. And I know that Aneesh and I agree on this. Even though when people say innovation, they often mean technology. Innovation, in my view, and I think in that Aneesh's as well, is about fresh thinking that creates value. And the harder part of this innovation process is the value creation. That can be value for shareholders, if you're a business, your own employees, but if you're a government or a social enterprise, it can be value for society, for citizenry. And the harder challenge for those of us who want to innovate is not coming up with a gadget or gizmo or even patents or IP, which is how people tend to look at this in governments when you see reports on how innovative our companies. They often measure number of PhDs or papers published or patents. These are inputs into the process, not outputs. We need to do the harder job of measuring value creation. Now, we encourage all of us to think hard in our own endeavors. What are the metrics of value creation? What are you doing that actually innovates? Not just invents, but innovates.
So let me answer your question, because in this context, let's focus on the value creation part. Part of the reason why there's an active role, and I would call it a different lowercase g government role, call that active, but active in the lowercase g, or frankly, the role of government is impatient convener, is the following reality. We have market conditions in the areas that are big global problems of health, energy, education, where the incentives and the market structures are essentially inhibiting or stalling the bringing to life the innovations and bringing to market. The president in his State of the Union in 2011 made a comment in referencing to this wireless initiative. He said, I see a future, something to the effect of, when patients can FaceTime video chat their doctors. If you remember that, there's a line in there about wireless communications. Today, that's an unreimbursable expense. If a physician treats a patient on the Android phone or iPhone or whatever and has a communication and engages, that experience, that 3 to 5 minute encounter, no reimbursement. You gotta have the patient schlep into the office, see them face to face, fill out the paperwork, and then you get paid. Not as productive. So in the Affordable Care Act, dare I say, we actually have market-making conditions for innovation. There's now an innovation center at Medicare whose entire focus is the value creation element, not the technological breakthrough. We have plenty of technological breakthrough. We don't have a way to go to market. The Innovation Center has the authority that if doctors and hospitals act or get paid differently, and that payment creates the incentive for them to go out and purchase infrastructure to treat patients in a better way, a way that's focused on outcomes, to Vijay's point, then you get to share in the savings. Doctors and hospitals will now find themselves saying, you know what, I can make more money, treat patients the way I want, utilize new communications technologies that have been around but never been put into my practice. And now I can do that in a way that Medicare says, if we test it and validate that you've seen improvements in quality and lower costs, you don't have to go back to managed payment. We have the authority to scale up innovations in payment tied to improvements in quality, lower costs. Same is true in solar energy. Now, Vijay's right, we don't have that one moonshot, but if you break down the solar problem, there is a technological and business model value creation portion. On the technological, you want to have the ability to convert solar to energy and then to incorporate that into the grid. That's basically a solar cell and a conversion or a transformer to that energy to put in the grid. But that's not all. You got to install it on a roof, which requires what? A permit. It turns out that the permitting bureaucracy burden on the solar installation problem is a $1 billion hidden tax. So we launched Race to the Rooftop to offer incentives to localities to streamline their processes so that solar permitting can be as efficient as OpenTable for reservations. If you do that, what is that? Is that an activist role, Vijay? I don't know how to define it, but you acknowledge that if you think of this as an all-hands-on-deck problem, you need better energy conversion and connection to the grid, but you need a pathway to market. And so therein lies, is that activist?
It's activist and stripping away.
But but the role of the Department of Energy is it created a grant program to localities to incentivize. So what is that? That's an increase in the Energy Department budget to focus on this problem and so forth. So it's a little bit of a different animal of just more money in the old system. It's a little bit more of a smarter model, or at least we attempted to.
So, Aneesh, as you pointed out, Tony, what you're talking about is a system that had misaligned incentives, often because of government intervention.
In the past.
In the past, that had been, and same with, whether it's energy or healthcare.
Yes.
Fundamentally misaligned incentives, and that is the result of a legacy of regulation and government involvement, and also sort of a mismatch, a balkanized system between federal regulation, for the case of energy with FERC, local PUCs. We saw what happened with the California blackouts, with the deregulation that went awry, and so there's a coordination problem.
Correct.
And there's a collective action problem here. But what motivates behavior is incentives, and so government has to act. And I've argued on the leader pages of The Economist, there is an important role for government in fixing the mistakes like these, the misalignment of incentives. But once you do that, when you start telling me which technologies should be invested in, I get a little bit concerned.
Agreed.
Right? So I think if we can, I can come with you so far. But I'd really like to see the people in this room and the people in the marketplace make money and lose money. As I say, greed, harnessing that greed for good. The role of incentives, we need to think hard about what we can do better with public policy. For example, in the dealing with the carbon taxes or some other form of dealing with the externalities of climate change and other forms of dirty energy that get a free ride, in my opinion. Now, I changed the editorial line of The Economist about a decade ago on climate change to argue that, in fact, there's a good, solid liberal economics argument for looking at carbon taxes or other means, public policy intervention, to deal with both market failure and government failure, policy failure in energy. But when you go further down that road, as it's so tempting to do, when you have the taxpayer purse at your fingertips, to pick which,
Yes.
There must be solar bonds, as California decided. Really? Why solar bonds? Oh, what's wrong with the other forms of renewable energy? Why not, for example, as Connecticut has recently done, have acknowledged that there may be a role for subsidy, but have it technology neutral. So what they have is a reverse auction, something that Chile pioneered with its free market reforms. They say we acknowledge there's a public good in renewable energy or clean energy, but we're not going to say which one of you guys is going to win. You come to us and bid for the smallest subsidy. And that way the taxpayer produces the smallest amount of subsidy. And so that's just one small example that I support creative approaches to government, but I just say be careful in how far you go in picking technology winners. The markets do it better, and when the money is lost, it should be. It should be lost by a VC or an entrepreneur.
Now let me push back slightly, because I agree, but I'm going to pivot a little bit. So in the solar example I referenced, there is no grand master plan that says we're betting on solar. What it is if you have an all-of-the-above approach, each individual pathway has its own idiosyncrasies as to why it hasn't come to market. So we do the race to the rooftop in solar because there's a specific permitting problem that needs addressing. If you ask me about energy efficiency, the intervention is not changing local government policy. It turns out that in the case of energy efficiency, it's standardizing the data formats for how the utility companies communicate with their customers, which would then fuel third-party applications. So the intervention in that one, Vijay, is green button, which allows us to standardize in an XML format in a voluntary consensus manner, built by the private sector, but off of a convening role that the government made. So if you ask me, am I picking energy efficiency and solar over wind? No, I'm saying as all of the above comes forward, each of them has their own diagnosis as to the barriers to innovation, and to the extent they fall under the convening role of government, that is, if there's a data problem, if there's a role we can play in convening, and if there are some sparks we can offer in prizes and challenges, those tools applied to any and all of the above, then there is a collection of those activities. It's not we bet the farm on one of those modalities. It's a slightly different twist.
But there is it has been in the administration, and not just in the administration, but outside the administration, and actually in some areas across party lines, right? In the sense that from a manufacturing base, right?
Yes.
Especially in clean energy, that we should find ways to support clean energy here, to create those products here and create those jobs here. Now, you both have engineers degrees, and I'll wear my economist hat and say, look, if we're in a global economy, and if somebody wants to produce solar panels and subsidize them for the United States market, why don't we pocket that payment, right? There are other ways we should be looking at to try to generate economic gain, and it shouldn't be trying to compete with the world's cheapest producers of solar panels.
I mean, though I'm an engineer, I play an economist on TV, having been an economist now 20 years, despite my youthful appearance, of course. And you hit the nail on the head in many ways. If somebody wants to provide excellent quality subsidized solar panels, we should be very pleased to take it if the Chinese taxpayer is going to suffer there. But there's a broader point here, that is, even China can't afford to do this forever. And what we're seeing, in a piece I have, actually a lead article in the latest Economist, on the end of cheap China. I've done a lot of reporting on the coastal heartland of China, where it really the workshop to the world for the last 20, 30 years. Double-digit wage inflation, a middle class that's risen up and actually demanding regulation. because they don't want their kids to have toxic sludge dumped on them by the factory next door. You're actually finding that costs are on the rise at places like Foxconn, which famously makes the iPads.
This is one of the
So even
the
cheap China
rare
is
earth
over.
arguments this week also, right? I mean, if you look at China has a point in this, right? Was that they were neglecting environmental concerns in extracting rare metals from the ground there. They said we don't want to do that forever, right? And that's one of the reasons they cited for restricting. They're changing also.
Well, let me take the issue of manufacturing head on, because it is a very difficult question. There are those who argue that there is a certain existential benefit, and maybe you would call it a market failure or something. The inability to have a designer and a producer in the same environment, that they breed off of each other and they actually create a better product. So the loss of manufacturing capacity in some ways hurts our design capacity, which has some effect. Now, I'm not smart enough to know the answer to this question, but I'll just share with you an anecdote to give you a flavor for why we struggle with this. So Progressive sponsored an X Prize that the Department of Energy participated in for the 100 mile per gallon vehicle. Now, if you recall, that prize was won by a car that was produced in the heartland of Virginia. Lynchburg, Virginia is not known to be an auto manufacturing haven. Yet the team that won the Oliver Kuttner's team, Team Edison 2, the team that won the X Prize, I asked Oliver, I said, Oliver, how did this happen? How does a guy like you in Lynchburg win this very, very aggressive competition against Detroit and other hubs that are known for auto manufacturing? He says, Aneesh, this may sound silly, but in Lynchburg, there still is manufacturing capacity. I would walk the town to find the screws, the nuts, the materials that I could tinker with back in the shop. So if we wanted to swap out a lighter design and lighter polymer or whatever, I literally could walk the streets and get a substitute good. This is not something you do in a global supply chain where you place an order on the internet, wait for the Chinese vendor to produce the widget to bring to your office 2 weeks later to put into the car. He said there was something about the kind of back and forth that happened in Lynchburg. This would not have happened if we didn't have Lynchburg. So I don't know what that means in a policy context, but there is definitely a concern that if we lost our manufacturing capacity and the infrastructure associated, I don't want to take that bet on America. That somehow the rest of the good goes away. So there is the tension.
But I think we don't have to. If we only see that there is a bright future for manufacturing in America, but it might mean redefining what we mean by manufacturing.
Amen.
There is actually a technology revolution happening. Thanks to computer-aided software, through 3D printing, we're seeing a democratization of the tools of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, it used to take hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions, to have a factory. Industrial lathes were big commitments, right? Well, guess what? If you go to California, you can go to a company called Tech Shop, which wants to be the Kinko's of the 3D printing world, of the new manufacturing revolution.
You know what product came out of Tech Shop?
Tell me. Well, I've had cases that I own, for example.
Yeah, but the Square, the hip new payment tool Square.
Yeah, exactly.
The widget that collects the credit card payment was produced at a Tech Shop.
And this is the kind of innovation.
Cool, right?
But we need to reimagine what it means. What does this mean? This means thinking about manufacturing not as a low-tech, brawny industry. Because guess what? We're not going to compete. If even China itself can't compete with the Vietnams and others that are coming behind it, we're not going to be able to compete on cost. We have to compete on ideas. And now we have the tools. So what I argue for is we need to make sure that our workforce has access to these tools and has the training, lifelong learning, and ultimately, even at the level of each one of us in this room, keep relearning how we learn. The very tools of learning are changing.
We have unfilled manufacturing jobs in the U.S. right now because of a shortage of skilled workers. This is the quandary.
That's my point.
You went exactly where I was hoping we would go with this, because we talked a little bit about energy, about healthcare. Education is it's a huge issue for the country. Having workers prepared, flexible enough, adaptive enough to deal with what the economy is going to look like. We also have a real big problem at the source, right? Which is that we have school districts in this country who are failing to graduate, or students who are failing to graduate at rates that are jaw-dropping. Or major city school districts, the dropout rate is 40 or 50%. It's a national tragedy. But so we're not preparing those students to survive and thrive in this economy that we're talking about. So how can we apply innovation to that challenge?
So this is why the president called for an ARPA for education, just to be clear. And let me give you the rationale for this. The size of the U.S. K-12 market is north of $700 billion. Anybody want to guess the share of that pie that goes to research and development for education? Right. It is right? It's like less than 0.5%. Compare that to the U.S. pharmaceutical industry, hundreds of billions of dollars, 15+% invested in R&D. Where is the R&D relevant? Well, Navy, through DARPA, invested in a program called Education Dominance. Forgive the name, it was the Navy. Education Dominance. What did they do? They said, we're going to take high school graduates and make them IT networking professionals, not in years, in months. They studied the best teachers in the United States, and what they found is what makes a great teacher is not an amazing lecture a la YouTube video. It's that they personalize the instruction to meet the needs of the student. So they had lots of ways of teaching this particular networking course, and based on the students' engagement with the platform, it served up the right method of teaching the material, personalized to the students' needs. They ran an experiment. The graduates of this program, in less than 4 months, I believe, outperformed professionals that had been on the job for 7 years. Now just think about this for a second. A high school graduate, average salary, we know is X. It ain't a lot. IT networking professional, at least doubles that. Now just think about this. America has a proof of concept that we could double the income of high school graduates just in this one example that DARPA has funded to prove to be successful. So the president said, we need more shots on goal. We need more R&D in this space. And look, we didn't get this funded, but we did create Digital Promise, which is a vehicle to hopefully tap private capital, nonprofit capital to bring R&D to market in the education business. But we're not going to say, take this 35-year-old previous worker in the mine and put them through a 4-year training program when they've got to put food on the table for their families. It's not realistic. We've got to come up with an innovation for how we teach. Now, some of this is fancy DARPA-like stuff, and some of this is just engaging the private sector. We had the privilege of about 2 weeks ago announcing an initiative called Summer Camp. If any of you are in the tech industry, please enroll in Summer Camp. What is Summer Camp? It turns out that the most accessible job in the IT software development space is quality assurance. Summer Camp is spelled QA, Summer QAMP. We are asking some of the most nimble and effective technology companies. Google it, you find it, summercamp.org.com or .org both, and you find GroupMe and Guilt Group and all these hip companies are saying we're going to bring in underprivileged youth this summer to train them on quality assurance work, give them hands-on experience. Now, are these kids going to see themselves getting a PhD in physics from MIT? Maybe, but that's not what they need. QA could be the equivalent of an on-ramp to a new career. That's an example of STEM for everyone. So yes, you need DARPA investments in areas like new models of learning, a la Education Dominance, and you got to think creatively with the private sector to say, can we onboard people in new ways, a la Summer Camp? Let's try both models and add even more to the mix. Maybe we'll break through.
We really have to. I want to get questions from you all, so get right in. And while you're thinking of a question to get to, Vijay, why don't you take it from there?
Sure. I'll make it short since I also want to get to questions from the audience. But I mean, the insight in, I think, Aneesh's examples that makes the most sense to me is we need to turn education into a system that's a learning system that has faster knowledge turns. You know, the way that the semiconductor industry on every chip makes sure it dedicates part of the square footage, precious square footage, to learning, to experimentation, to finding out what doesn't work. And absolutely, and that's one of the lessons that Andy Grove learned, former chairman of Intel, early on. And we think of our health system, our education system, our energy system. These are very slow learning systems. And oftentimes the knowledge in one part is not translated. The number of pilot cases like that DARPA experiment you gave me, gosh, you know, it's this death by pilot, unfortunately. right? And now how do we scale? How do we make sure that same experiment is repeated or done poorly somewhere else? To me, that's the challenge, and there is a convening role for government, and I applaud the efforts that Aneesh and others have done in this. But I would say, if you're talking about your own career and the education of your own kids, guess what? We're in a world where you can't just put your kid in the system, as we might have done 50 years ago, and they turn out just fine, because the world has changed. We're not fundamentally an industrial economy. The U.S. particularly, more than any other part of the developed world, is in a post-industrial economy. Almost 80% of our GDP, more than Europe or Japan, comes from using brain, not brawn. And that proportion is going to increase. And if you look at the sectors and the talents, that doesn't mean you have to have a Caltech PhD, don't get me wrong. It means including, for example, what Toyota learned a long time ago. They took the industrial model that Henry Ford made his specialty, the commoditization of the shop floor, and said, actually, rather than having this assembly line, let me empower my workers. These are the guys who know best what works and what doesn't. 4 work groups. Those were knowledge workers in my view, because they added value to the production line. And if we think about this up and down the value chain and say everyone can be an innovation, part of the innovation economy, I think that's where you get towards the move away from the tiger mom mentality, right? We all remember this, China's eating our lunch because of tiger moms. Hey, you know what? I say, the idea that somehow discipline is more important than play, that we need to have deference to authority, and that beats dissent, that we need to have this whole memorization, standardization, that'll beat creativity. Nonsense. Nonsense. If we want to be an innovation superpower, of course we have to do reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? But that's just the price of entry. That's the ticket to join the club. If we want to be the innovation superpower in the 21st century, which I think America will be if we get this right, memorization, standardization, harmonization will be trumped by disruptive innovation.
Amen.
Here, here.
Amen.
Yeah.
All right.
Questions? Let's start a microphone. She's trapped.
Tell us who you are.
Hi, my name is Shalina Wadwani. I work for Deloitte Consulting. I just had a question. So you talked about some of the drivers for innovation in the immediate future, right? So healthcare, energy, education, high tech, meaningful use, etc. Can you talk a little bit about just looking 15, 20, 30 years out, what you think the drivers will be, whether it's in robotics, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence?
That's a Vijay question.
Thank you. Predict the future. Predict the future, exactly. Of course, you should read the book. That will tell you all the answers in great detail. Speedfree.com. But if you're, even though we live in an age of really wicked problems, and I'm a realist, a sober realist about how difficult the problems are and how we've actually not begun to deal with the most difficult of them, right? We've been preoccupied in Washington with the war on terror post 9/11 and the global financial crisis post Enron, post Lehman, and it's only right. These are difficult problems. But from the view of 2100, the long view that you're asking me, we're not going to be judged on those. I mean, political terrorism has been with us for over 1,000 years. This is nothing new. It's new to us, but it's not new. And capitalism has always gone hand in hand with crisis. Think about the tulip bubbles and the South Sea manias of yore. The really new problems. How do you deal with the rise of China, India, Brazil, 1 billion more people wonderfully being lifted out of poverty, joining the middle classes? How do you deal with this era of globalization and globalization? Yes, I said it. It's been a great age for many people, but it's been great for the bottom billion who have access to mobile phones, microbanking, things that I don't even have in New York, and China is one of the sort of globalistas. But the middle class is increasingly squeezed, right? We know this. In this age, I think, to answer your question, we need to connect the bottom-up innovation revolution that's bubbling up. And here I see exponential technologies emerging, often stealthily. And we know about the internet, we know a lot of us about the coming big data revolution and cloud computing. It's going to transform industry after industry. But if you look at genomics, proteomics, synthetic biology, many of these technological drivers are at that knee of the curve of exponential growth. And here's the fascinating thing. These technologies are converging. Who would have predicted even 5 years ago that the climate challenge may be solved by synthetic biology? Right? I mean, it would have been fantasy to think that somebody would invent life. Of course, I'm talking about Craig Beckner. And he's betting his ranch that this is going to be one of the solutions to clean energy, right? And so solutions that we can't even imagine, business models that would be ludicrous or unimaginable today will emerge in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And that's what is the spirit of this gathering and the public here. Let's have that imagination. Let's be ambitious. So I think I can't predict the future, but I can predict that we can see the technological trends. We can see how they're converging in an anarchic, chaotic way from the bottom up. My argument and the green piece of my book, I put it a little bit cheaply, obviously, is let us reward innovators that work on socially important problems better than we do today. If we do, we're going to get these solutions.
One quick plug on this. I will never predict the future because it's way beyond my pay grade, but I will say this. The president has a Council of Advisors of Science and Technology. Eric Schmidt chairs one of the working groups on innovation, and I had the honor of joining a meeting that I couldn't believe took place. Eric and Shirley Ann Jackson, the president of Rensselaer, convened the kind of the brightest minds under 40, if you will, kind of disruptive innovators for a 3-hour, it's all a live webcast. So if you go to whitehouse.gov and you search Eric Schmidt, PTAC, P-I-T-A-C, you'll see a 3-hour discussion. And what I learned from that discussion was, at least just as an observer, I'm not anywhere near as smart necessary to figure this thing out, but it appeared as if the most incredible ideas were at the intersection of bio, info, and nano. So it wasn't bio alone, info alone, and nano alone in their silos innovating and delivering great work. It was when they were cross-pollinating, and that there was something magical when they were describing what was happening when they were cross-pollinating that gave me a little bit of, whoa, let's keep our eye out on this. So watch that 3-hour video if you have the time. You'll be inspired. And then take a look at that intersection. You'll see hopefully more R&D investments in that intersection.
Hi, yes, I'm Elena Nolan with the Council on Competitiveness. Thank you all for being here today. I think the last 15 or so minutes of your discussion was actually probably the most interesting to me. Yes.
I talk the least.
That's what I was thinking. No, just kidding. I guess my comment would be that you're talking a lot about innovation in very broad terms. And while I think that smaller innovations such as Square payment system or other small ones can certainly converge to create much more significant changes in longer terms, I didn't hear a lot in your discussion about bigger innovations, the kind of things that have actually really led the U.S. to be the successful country that it is today. And I get nervous, I suppose, when I think about there are innovations that, for instance, our national labs have sitting on their shelves for 15, 20 years ahead of the market. And what are we doing to help bring those to market? Those are the kind of things that are really going to launch the U.S. to be a more successful country. And I'd be interested to hear your comments on that.
May I make 2 brief points? Number one, thank you for your point of view. That the celebration of innovators and entrepreneurs is, as esoteric as that feels, is actually an important way of bringing attention to the opportunity in the federal labs. So many of those labs are, first of all, the president signed an order kind of directing more of the commercialization opportunities. But to make it real, Secretary Chu launched the America's Next Top Energy Innovator. So we dropped the price of what it costs to take an option on one of the intellectual property rights in one of the federal labs, down to like $1,000 for an option. And hundreds of people began trolling for opportunity. And we just announced the first winners, if you will, the celebration. And all they won, they didn't win any money. We gave them floor space on the ARPA-E Summit, drawing attention to the America's Next Top Energy Innovator. Pretty interesting model. But I would make a second point, which is, look, there are 2 theories of how to approach innovation policy. One is we need to have the next big thing. And the second is let's take a look at how job growth is created in the United States. And it turns out McKinsey did a study. Job growth is related to productivity growth. Sectors that are more productive actually lead to more jobs. That was counterintuitive to me. And when you looked at the sectors of the U.S. economy that have had no productivity growth, health, energy, education, government itself, dare I say, it becomes very clear that in order to spur the kind of turbocharged economic of job growth, which I think is the point of innovation policy is ultimately job growth, the question is what we need then is we need to spark innovation to basically produce productivity growth in these laggard sectors. And that's where we got to these tools. Well, you need data to measure outcomes in order to know what your productivity growth is. You need to spark things by challenges and prizes. And occasionally, you need to convene folks to lower barriers to entry so there's more shots on goal. So that's where the tools that we put forward speak to the sectors that have lagged. It's less that than saying we're inventing the next big X, because that's where picking winners and losers is a bit of a challenge. That's my view.
We also can't forget, though, that we've been outrageously successful. We're building on a pretty good base.
We are.
Yeah.
So, and one thought I'd add is there's a lot more serendipity in building the future than perhaps any one of us would like. You talked about the great things that made American progress possible. Let's look at the 20th century, the great American century. I think the 21st century will also be the great American century, but not necessarily because of specific things we can do and predict right now. Look at the motor car, look at grid electrification, we look at modern chemistry. The great Victorian age of invention, 130 years ago, produced the groundwork. Ultimately, the telegraph, for example, was produced at that time. But these things came to market in anarchic ways, not in ways that were predicted. Otto Diesel came up with his wonderful diesel engine 40 years before there was an oil industry that was ready to supply that oil in any meaningful way. And at the time, in 1900, there's a famous race in New York City of motor cars, in which steam and multiple other kinds of cars were racing against the gasoline engine. And the gasoline engine didn't win. People, shouted at the gasoline engine car, and the electric car was the one that won. They said, look, yo, get a horse, which they were pretty commonly heard to the guy driving the putt-putt gasoline car. Who would have predicted that the internal combustion engine and oil would be the iron nexus that would power 20th century American greatness? Right? So I think we can't be too deterministic about these things, but what we can do is invest in the enablers of innovation. That's why I come back to infrastructure, a point Aneesh made very well, R&D, something that I talked about, these drivers, and of course education. These pillars, I think, are what we can say with certainty, and including at a time of fiscal austerity here in Washington and in a downturn. Great companies, business case studies show this, business history shows, great companies invest in a downturn. And if we were to ask, what was the greatest century of innovation and progress in business models and innovation in the 20th century, very few of us would say it would be the era of the Great Depression, right? Sounds like a terrible time. Conventional history says it was actually the post-war period, where sort of, getting ready for World War II, mobilized our factories. Guess what? A marvelous work of economic history done by Alexander Field, an economic historian, a distinguished expert that's destined, I think, to win a Nobel, actually shows from the economic data, it was the 1930s. Greatest productivity growth, greatest innovation, and what happened. The companies that were great invested in the downturn, and others found more productive ways to connect mind and money to markets. I think that's how we should think right now. Invest in the drivers of innovation. Make the cuts elsewhere. It won't be easy, but don't cut to the bone.
There's a barrier to that through teachers' unions. How do you see innovation, whether it be technology innovation or policy innovation, changing the culture of public school education in the United States for the foreseeable future? Because Aneesh, you pointed out that teachers are the driving force behind how students learn and how quickly they learn. But is there a way to combat teacher unions or other barriers to the education industry that will spur innovation and up graduation rates and everything else?
Let me just answer this way. Look, there's a broader debate about education for which I'm way not qualified to answer. However, when Arne Duncan called for the Open Education Data Initiative, we basically had three theories of the case. Theory of the case number one, if we move to an outcomes-based model of learning, called the Common Core Standards, essentially a way of measuring what we think we want the country to learn in math, you start to have the market conditions. So now what happens is a startup in education is shooting for the same goal. Right? There's now 40x plus states that have adopted this. Now why is that relevant? Because now there can be this idea of a GPS system for your math progression. Now I can find out if there are 150 concepts in math that are in the Common Core. Now I should be able to know, is my child, if I'm a parent, are they on track, or do I need to recalculate my route? Because the kid has missed some enabling concepts of math that I need to go in the aftermarket and buy supplemental learning materials to get the kid back on track. Today, ask the parent, how many of you know where your kid is on the learning progression? They don't have a clue. So number one, you gotta have an outcome, and I think Common Core gets us a lot of the way there. Number two, you have to liberate the data. In order to create that GPS system, what Arne Duncan announced was that companies, to their credit, Pearson, Houghton Mifflin, and others, pledged to Arnie that they would make a My Data button. So a parent or a student could log into the assessment system and download all the material that's there. Is it perfect? No. Will it be comprehensive immediately? No, but it'll get better with time. What that will do is that data, when I take it out of the K-12 system where you've got official bureaucracy, now I can go out to a third-party app store and say, this is what I know of my child's performance. Let there be a competitive market to compete to help get my kid back on track or to help push them forward. So that's door number 2. Liberate the data to seed future app stores, create more productivity. And then 3, to support teachers in the classroom and apps for teachers like Construct. It turns out today, they have no tools to build lesson plans. It's a neighbor telling a friend who emailed, whatever. It's completely fragmented. Well, we created this learning registry standard, convening the standard. Arnie announced the standard in November, learningregistry.org, and Pearson, Houghton Mifflin, PBS all voluntarily said, we're going to tag all learning objects against the Common Core and make them discoverable. So a teacher could literally find out, a teacher in Akron, Ohio used the Mars rover video in a lesson plan to teach gravity for the kids in this Hispanic majority school district. Now, like when Facebook newsfeed will discover that she has done this or he has done this, I can grab that lesson plan and remix it and make it available. So you're starting to see this apps economy emerge to support teachers because of the standards of the learning registry and to create better tools to close gaps because you've liberated assessment data. The Arnie Duncan, badass as he is, has championed this movement, and I would encourage you to read Open Education Data Initiative to give you a flavor for, look, that's not solving the macro issue of union, this, that, that's just this sliver.
I would just add one thought to that. That is, in addition to these promising ideas, the real solutions are going to come when we take ownership of our children's education. That is, as parents, you need to be much more involved, and as individuals, we need to be much more involved. And now there are the tools. These are tools that are coming from government and with help from the technology
Lowercase
sector.
g.
Lowercase g, the convening power, and that's great. But look, you know, in this age, if you go to Khan Academy, which in this room I think most people would have heard of, nonprofit site, completely free. More than 1 million kids around the world are learning very high quality video that uses, for example, incentive tools from gaming to motivate children to learn. It doesn't have to be Sal Khan, although he's a great guy. I profile him in the book. It can be somebody else, right? They can have a competition with these things. But the point is, you learn at your own pace. And in public school systems in California, Palo Alto, for example, they're experimenting with using this in class so that the teacher becomes part of the solution, not part of the political problem. Teachers are seeing this as a liberating force. You do the basic education at home using this Khan Academy or other rival methods to learn at home, but when you come in, the teacher works with you one-on-one. It liberates the classroom for peer-to-peer instruction, for example, which is how kids learn the joy of learning, teaching others. I think there's a wonderful time of experimentation that's made possible. You know what, if your kid is great in some things, behind in some others, you can get an inexpensive tutor online from Kerala. Take charge of your and your children's education, because that commoditized, one-size-fits-all education system, it might have worked for a while in the industrial economy, it doesn't work anymore.
Vijay, real quick, I visited the Los Altos Hills School where the Khan pilot is running in 5th grade class. Teacher loved it, was empowered, the school district supported her. 5th grade kid finished calculus. Not because he was the child of Nobel Prize winners. In the book Outliers, Gladwell talked about shots on goal, thousands of hours of training. The kid spent 3 hours a night on the videos because he was that engaged with the material, and that naturally led him. And I'm like, come on, man, show me your equation. And he got it. The point is, we don't know what those tools will bring if you have a 24/7 mindset. It is exciting to say the least.
Hello, Raina, AIAC Investments. Question, it deals more towards entrepreneurship. Some of the greatest success of American executives, take for instance Walton from Walmart or Ray Kroc from McDonald's, it came from customer service, it came from filling a niche, what have you. In all due respect to the garage startups and what have you there. Question, and Aneesh, more towards what you did at the White House, did you all study how these entrepreneurs worked, and even more so, what prevents, or how do you prevent sort of this divide between sort of rural versus urban, so that it is sort of a shared platform?
So let me just, this is really the President's Startup America initiative, where the President tasked the team to help understand what is it that drives economic growth, and the statistics are actually pretty clear. Most net new jobs come from young companies under 5 years of age. And the question is, our policy framework really doesn't understand that. It's small business or big business, not new business. And so Startup America was a public-private partnership to understand, well, what are the challenges of new business? And it turns out that there's some barriers policy-wise that have made it harder for them to get capital, which the President called for, crowdfunding rules and other techniques that Congress is taking up, which is a way to get the barriers out of the way. We also understood that there's some customer acquisition challenges, so the private sector has also stepped up to say, can big companies better interoperate with little guys? So even Google and other big companies are now, through Startup America Partnership, no taxpayer dollars, offering $1.2 billion of their own in-kind resources to better connect with startups. So that's an example of helping them to get a customer first. And then third, we understood that there are these new markets. So there's a Stanford professor who studied the Japanese economy and said, look, cheerleading for startups doesn't necessarily yield an outcome that is working. But if you create new market conditions, the folks who are going to exploit those new rules will likely be startups. So in large part, the work we focused on is if we wanted startups in health, energy, and education, the more we change the rules. We've got Common Core in education. We've got a whole bunch of smart grid activity and green button activity. We've got a bunch of healthcare work with the Affordable Care Act in the Innovation Center. There are new rules of the road. Startups are racing to those opportunities really fast. So if you diagnose the problem, Rob, by just listening and engaging in an open and transparent way, you uncover that there are these little nits. Now, is it the one magic bullet? Here's the startup killer app. No, it's a lot of little things. But you create this grassroots movement around it, and I'm really excited about the potential, and it looks to be bipartisan, and it hopefully will pass, and we'll see a real improvement in the environment for startups.
Good fun. Absolutely. I think we have time for one last question. Is that right?
Rapid fire.
Go for it. Yeah.
Ken Jargle, Athena Alliance. I finished the book just before I came over here, and Vijay.
You still came, so thank you.
And I still came, and thank you for the shout out to the Bernanke speech in the book that was at our conference on intangibles last year that I know you got some material from, which brings me to my question. In the book, you talk about the importance of intangibles, but you never get to any policy recommendations. And we seem to always default back to, well, it's all R&D or it's all education. What else can we be doing to foster intangible assets? And Aneesh, you can take this one as well. The government is the convener for customer relations, design thinking, all the other intangibles that we seem to forget.
Well, first, let's, for those who don't follow this debate, Ben Bernanke made out what I thought was a very important speech, where he recognized innovation as the driver in the 21st century of the U.S. economy, but in particular, the intangibles part of the economy. I mean, here at Google, the most valuable asset the company has walk out the door at the end of the day, between the ears of the employees, right? And in an economy that's knowledge-based, open, network, user-driven innovation models are what are driving the greatest value creation, not the old-fashioned silos. How do you put that on a balance sheet? So things that could help. You asked for very concrete things. A couple of things. We can talk longer over drinks as people will stay here. We're almost out of time. Let me offer two small ideas. For example, we could actually move towards accounting standards and rules that recognize the value of intangibles. And there are efforts underway. And I know that your group is involved and others are. I applaud this, and that's a great thing because we have to recognize intangibles have value, market value, and we should recognize them on the books and count them in our GDP. We would see a much greater distance between the Chinese economy size and the U.S. economy size if we measured this correctly, for example. And so that might tone down some of the zero-sum thinking that we see in the political conversation today. Another small example. The way that government provides tax credits for R&D. There are a lot of problems with the stopgap way that the U.S. has done in the past. Fixing that would be great, but Canada does a better way, where open innovation and network innovation is actually recognized as something that can also benefit from the same tax break. In the U.S., we're not there yet. If you have an open innovation model, you don't benefit fully. It's treated differently than if you had a silo like an old Xerox PARC or AT&T Bell Labs model of silo research. So I think we can do better still. We do well in America, but we can do better still.
We're in overtime. I don't think any of the basketball games went to overtime today, but I don't know about you, but I felt very badly for Tony as the moderator that he had to work so hard at our speakers. I think you would agree this was an extraordinarily rich, informative, and provocative discussion. If you do agree, I encourage you to tell your friends. They can view it on YouTube, a Google property, or milkeninstitute.org. You may be inclined to watch it again. I also, again, want to thank Pablo and Erica and Jen and everybody else at Google for hosting this event for us here this afternoon. I was remiss earlier in not acknowledging Daniel Gorfine and Diana Dunn at the Milken Institute, who were principally responsible for really bringing this together. I also want to acknowledge, I talked about innovation being a hallmark of the Milken Institute previously. Acknowledge Margaret Anderson, who's under the light back here, who's the director of our Faster Cures initiative, where it really brings all of that together. We've been given a lot of food for thought, that's metaphorically. Now we've got real food. But we've got a little, it's going to be a behavioral exercise here, anthropological experiment. We have books, we have drinks, and we have food. So we're going to see.
This is unfair. I mean, I'm very grateful for Google providing books, thank you. But when I go up against free beer, boy, that's tough. So I hope some of you will come and find me by the book.
Thank you all again for joining us. We hope to see you again, and please join me in thanking
Thank
our
you.
Thank you.